I want you to picture 1950s New York. Perhaps you're seeing crowds in the bustling city, jazz clubs, Broadway, images of mid-century glamour and sophistication. 1950s New York holds a place in our collective cultural imagination. We have ideas of what it would be like to be there and live there. But what do you do when it's 2013 and you want to make a movie set in New York City in 1952? Well, you can't film it in New York City because the New York of today has a lot less of the New York of yesterday. So, if you're director Todd Haynes, you go to Cincinnati. The movie I'm talking about is Carol, directed by Todd Haynes and starring Cate, Blancett, and Rooney Mara. The film is a love story about two women, Carol and Therese, who, despite differences in age and class, fall in love in the 1950s in New York City. And it turns out that Cincinnati is a perfect stand-in for 1950s New York.
The architecture here is phenomenal. Even this building we're sitting in right now, there's so many beautiful buildings that haven't been zhuzhed up or gentrified in the 70s or 80s, where you've got to unpick all that stuff. And I don't think we would have been able to do what we've done in New York, where the film is set.
Chosen for its pristine 19th century urban neighborhoods, Cincinnati contains both the largest collection of Italianate architecture in the country and the most intact urban historic district, making it the ideal spot to stand in for New York. The production team even found a well-preserved and empty department store, which is a pivotal location to the plot of the film. And outside the city, the grand homes built by the business tycoons of the last century stood in for Carol and Harge's New Jersey mansion, and the homes of their friends and family.
Wonderful. Cincinnati is a really, it's a great place to shoot in. And you could be in an apartment, a walk-up like her apartment, and when you look out the window, it really looked like New York in the early 50s, because the buildings still, they weren't just like high rises out the window. So there's parts of Cincinnati that are totally caught in that period.
But the buildings and the costumes and the production design just formed the concrete backdrop of the era. Haynes and cinematographer Edward Lachman were able to create a more realized feeling of the time and place by referencing the street photography and Ektachrome color photography of the early 50s. Now, Ektachrome was one of the first commercially available color films and one of Kodak's flagship chrome films. The other one you might have heard of was called Kodachrome. The advantage with chrome film is that they have beautiful, vibrant colors. They were the preferred choice of magazine and advertising photographers who needed bold colors and vivid details to sell their products or capture exotic, far-off places. It's a look that immediately signifies the 1950s, and they looked at photographs by Esther Buble, Vivian Maier, Ruth Orkin, and Saul Lieter. Lachman made the choice to use Super 16mm film instead of digital, and then muted and desaturated the color, and this allowed him to mimic the look of those old snapshots. A look he and Haynes felt more embodied the restrained austerity of post-war America than the bright color film used in motion pictures of the era.
The idea like you're picking up a photograph. If you picked up a photograph of that time period, that's the way it would look. And I don't think I ever could have gotten that look in 35mm film, because it's almost grainless like digital, or the digital world, because that's so grainless.
And the film is gorgeous. It has an impressionistic look. Not only does it give us a city in abstraction, by filming Carol and Therese through car windows, glass, raindrops, and steam, we not only get some of the most beautiful imagery seen on film in the last 20 years, but also insight into their emotional state. Two women not quite sure where they stand with each other, and Therese not quite sure of herself. And all of this combines to give the film an almost ephemeral feel. There is an awareness of the fleetingness of time and how this story, temporally, is already over, even as we're just discovering it. Like we're looking into an old photo album. And in this movie, every frame is so perfectly conceived that it could indeed be a photograph. Because there is never again going to be another winter of 1952 in New York City. The best any filmmaker can do is to approximate a look, and more importantly, a feel of a lost time and place, and hope that we, the viewer, for just a little while, can get lost in it.
It's a rare and wonderful experience for any actor to be able to recreate the life of a close personal friend, particularly when that life is as exciting and dramatic as Eddie Duchin's.
Disclaimer: the Eddie Duchin story is not a great movie. It's a good movie, and it's an old-fashioned movie, but it's not a great movie. It has big stars, Tyrone Power and Kim Novak, and it was the 10th highest grossing movie of 1956. It's one of those 1950s biopics that has a lot more pick than bio to it. And there were a lot of those. The Glenn Miller Story, Love Me or Leave Me, Victor Mature as Crazy Horse, anyone? Life stories told on screen where the truth is stretched, twisted, or even fabricated and covered with saccharin to be served to the public as a quote-unquote true story. The Eddie Duchin story is guilty of all of that. It's also guilty of being set in the years between the late 1920s and the late 1940s, but never really looking like anything other than 1955. Putting all of that aside, what it does have is its Academy Award-nominated cinematography by Harry Stradling, giving us beautiful color scenes of mid-50s New York masquerading as the 1930s. The movie follows the rise and tragic end of popular bandleader and piano player Eddie Duchin, who gained prominence in the early 30s playing what was termed as sweet music. His wife died 6 days after the birth of his son Peter, and Peter would go on to be raised by family friends. Eddie, he would serve in the Navy during World War II, and upon his return, never really regained his pre-war popularity. He died at the age of 41 from leukemia. Tyrone Power, who had been a personal friend of Eddie Duchin's, gives a pretty solid performance, aided by his prep work months prior to filming, where he learned the intricate keyboard fingering for the musical numbers. Kim Novak is beautiful and extremely melodramatic. As far as the movie goes, Peter Duchin has written very negatively about the script, saying there was too much unnecessary fictionalization of his parents' lives and deaths. We're here for the mood. Shot on location in New York City between August and October of 1955, with what appears to be the absolute bare minimum of consideration for period accuracy. It's the waning days of summer, and it's autumn in the city, and that's what the cinematography beautifully captures. But even as early as the 1950s, New York had lost a lot of those 1920s landmarks. The production design team had to recreate locations like the luxurious Central Park Casino, one of New York's most expensive nightclubs, and the place where Duchin got his start, because by 1955, it was already a piece of lost New York. It fell victim to Prohibition and the Depression and was demolished in 1936. But there are some beautiful street scenes and exterior shots of ivy-covered buildings, and the Waldorf Astoria Starlight Roof, which is now a pool. And there's the romance of the city with its old skyline. And even though this apartment is a studio set with a painted backdrop, it's so evocative of the glamour and romance of the city at mid-century. Through its open windows, the world is alive with vibrant possibility. The Eddie Duchin story is cinema's first real lush, romantic love letter to New York City. I've watched this scene on repeat more times than I can count. But autumn is also the season of melancholy and loss.
Hey! This is where you used to play the piano. The Central Park Casino used to be here, didn't it, Dad?
We know that we're headed for a very tragic end. When we first see Tyrone Power, He's playing Eddie Duchin as a 20-something-year-old man. And it's a credit to his ability to convince us of Duchin's naivete and eagerness, so much so that we forget he's 41 years old at the time. And Eddie's wonder and excitement about the unlimited possibilities of life in the big city, it's a universal story. Columbia marketed the film as an old-fashioned story. Its music, lush and melodic, meant to push back against the ever-popular rock and roll. The film was meant to give an experience that movies' top pest, television, could never provide. And it does that, with its soundtrack, its cinematography, and its big-name stars. And even though the true story differs from this fictionalized account, the brick and the stone and the concrete of the city at mid-century is true. To quote that old Rodgers and Hart song, "The great big city is a wondrous toy, made for a girl and boy. We'll take Manhattan and turn it into an Isle of Joy." New York in the 1950s. We've been here before. We've visited the exquisitely production-designed world of 2015's Carol, which beautifully and faithfully recreated 1952 New York City by way of Cincinnati, and Decoy, the groundbreaking 1957 police drama starring Beverly Garland as policewoman Casey Jones. But as Decoy was airing on television screens across America, On the Bowery, a small independent docudrama, was making the circuit at various international film festivals and showing another side of New York City. It took viewers down to a neighborhood in the city's Lower East Side, and it pulled no punches. This was not manufactured or production design grit and squalor. This was the real thing. This was the real life of people on the fringes, an urban environment populated by men living on the very edge of society. In its brief 62 minutes, it chronicles the everyday existence of the men who drink their nights away in shady taverns and sleep rough on the streets or in flop houses, and take up day work, if they're sober enough, just to earn enough money for the next night's drinking. On the Bowery shatters whatever rose-colored glasses one may wear when looking back on the past. It lifts the cloud of nostalgia to remind us how easy it is to forget that struggle and suffering is not unique to our age. And it shows us that when popular images of the past, especially ones disseminated in motion pictures and television, are scrubbed clean of street-level reality, it can distort how we contextualize our history. This is only one side of the 1950s. This is another. On the Bowery was directed and produced by Lionel Rogosian, a Yale-educated son of a textile mogul. He had served in the Navy during World War II, and following the war, before taking a waiting job in his father's factory, he traveled through the devastated and bombed-out countries of Eastern Europe and throughout Africa, seeing firsthand the effects of colonialism and imperialism. He'd studied to be a chemical engineer, but by the early 50s, he'd begun to express a growing concern over racism and fascism. So, he taught himself how to use a camera, and in 1954 he left the family business to devote himself to promoting peace and confronting the pressing issues of his day, like the threat of nuclear war, imperialism, and racism. Apartheid was to be his first target, but in order to make a film against it, he had to learn how to make a film, and he decided to learn by going down to the Bowery, New York's Skid Row. By the turn of the last century, the place had gained a reputation, and by 1930, the Bowery was home to 14,000 homeless people, mostly men. And in 1954, this is the place where Lionel Rogosian came to make his first documentary. Inspired by the work of the Italian neo-realist directors like Roberto Rossellini and Vittorio De Sica, as well as Louis Milestone's 1930 version of All Quiet on the Western Front, Rogosian set to work documenting life on the Bowery. And while researching for the film, he got to know the street and the men intimately, befriending Ray Salyer as he was seeking day labor, and Gorman Hendricks, a longtime Bowery resident and former newspaper reporter. And it's around these two men that Rogosian crafted his story. This film isn't a straight documentary, it's a docudrama, and the plot loosely revolves around Ray Salyer, a former railroad worker who has recently moved to the Bowery and still has enough money to buy drinks for his fellow derelicts on his first night there. However, after blacking out, Ray discovers that all his possessions have been stolen. And as he tries to extricate himself from life on the Bowery, he becomes friends with Gorman, a petty thief. And Ray, as he looks for work, drinks his nights away, goes to the local mission, gets into fights, and eventually succumbs to his surroundings. And Rogosian covertly captures the desperate real lives going on around this story. To get true scenes of Bowery life, cameraman Dick Bagley hid his 35mm camera under a bundle to shoot in the bars, and sometimes they filmed from the back seat of cars. The actors for the film were taken off the street and spoke their own lines, and were only guided in what to say or given the scenario that was going to play out.
The minute you come to the front door in the evening, at 6 o'clock, to come down here, the man will see whether you've had a drink or not. If you're under the influence of liquor, you cannot sleep in the dormitory.
When filming began, the 3rd Avenue L had ceased running, but it had not yet been demolished, so its dark shadows added to the overall dingy atmosphere. And this place is unlike anything I've ever seen. On my first viewing, I was shocked at how raw and desperate the entire thing feels. We are seeing real people here, most of them in life and death battles with alcoholism. There are no studio sets. On the Bowery is where they sleep and eat if they can get a meal, but mostly it's where they drink. Theirs is a struggle for a type of survival, and it's unfamiliar to a lot of us. Critics of the time, of course, found the downbeat subject matter gloomy, and they're not wrong. But like life, not all stories have a happy ending, and not all lives are lived in CinemaScope and Technicolor. After the film's nomination for Best Documentary at the 1957 Academy Awards and its Best Documentary win at the Venice Film Festival, Ray Salyer was offered $40,000 by a Hollywood studio to come to California. And he is charismatic with a natural talent and the look of a typical 1950s male star. You could see why the studios would be interested. But he turned them down, preferring to stay on the Bowery. Gorman Hendricks died in New York of cirrhosis of the liver just weeks before the film opened. Rogosian took care of his burial. Ray Salyer died in New York City from the effects of alcoholism in 1963. Rogosian would go on to make his anti-apartheid documentary, the critically acclaimed Come Back Africa, as well as others. And the Bowery? Well, just like Hendricks and Salyer, the L tracks are long gone, and so are all those men who lived on the fringes. You can be forgiven if you've never heard of the 1958 syndicated television show Decoy. It ran for just one season and starred Beverly Garland as New York City policewoman Casey Jones. Decoy was directly inspired by Dragnet, and its roots are obvious with its brassy opening score, its voiceover narration, and its procedural police work which moved across authentic city locations to investigate the crime of the week. But Decoy was groundbreaking because it directed its focus on the work of policewomen, specifically one policewoman, Casey Jones. It was the first television program to feature a female cop in any capacity, let alone lead protagonist. And it was the first show to film entirely on location in New York City. Each week, Officer Jones went undercover to root out killers, deadbeat dads, drug dealers, rapists, and a whole host of criminal types.
We're New York's finest. We're policewomen.
Garland's policewoman was a strictly by-the-book officer whose dedication to the job, much like Joe Friday, came at the sacrifice of any personal life. And from the very first episode, Stranglehold, which aired on October 14, 1957, Decoy was committed to giving viewers across the country a street-level view of late 1950s New York City. The show's low budget encouraged a more guerrilla style of street filmmaking that allowed the authentic people and places to be captured in an almost documentary film style. In Beverly Garland, Her Life and Career, Garland described a process where the main directorial strategy was to avoid drawing attention to the camera, so passers-by wouldn't look into the lens and ruin the take. In Stranglehold, Casey moves into a seedy rooming house in an effort to befriend a woman named Molly, whose former boyfriend is a suspect in a jewelry heist. The low-budget technique allowed director Donald Medford to get street scenes of Lever House, Colony Records, and an overall general vibe of 1957 New York City. We get to follow Molly on her evening stroll as she goes along Broadway and 47th Street. We get to be there in the crowds and underneath the glowing theater marquees. We get to linger under the giant glittering display for Elia Kazan's Baby Doll. It's Saturday night, it's 1957, and we get to mingle out in the crowd. In the very next episode, The Red Clown, Casey searches for a young girl who has taken the subway alone from her home in Queens to Manhattan to look for her father, a painter, who has abandoned the family for an artist's life in Greenwich Village. While some later episodes will solely use city exteriors as establishing shots or to bridge scenes, The Red Clown is almost entirely filmed on the city streets. The tree-lined avenues of Queens, transit stations, and McDougal Street in Greenwich Village. We see places like the still operating Cafe Reggio and its neighboring shops and restaurants. In The Glass Necklace, Casey poses as a wealthy socialite with an expensive jewelry collection to lure a successful burglar into a trap. We get a montage of the city's in spots, nightclubs, jazz clubs, and lounges. Late nights out for the sophisticated set, dining, drinks, jazz, 52nd Street, then over to Greenwich Village, and on until the early morning hours. Showplace, Decoy's 21st episode, Casey pretends to be a nightclub entertainer in order to investigate a murder, and the show gives us some great time capsule shots of Broadway and Times Square, like the entrance to the old Sheraton Astor Hotel, which was demolished in 1967. Decoy, of course, was a product of its time, and some of the plots were a bit out there. For example, episode 24, Saturday Lost, revolves around a murder investigation that ends with Casey arresting a young woman who has lost her memory after an all-night pot party. In an attempt to help the girl recall the events of that lost Saturday, she and Casey emerge from the 116th Street Columbia University station and visit a series of local college bars. The show's final episode, The Lost Ones, aired on July 8, 1958. Casey is in the Bronx to visit a girl she arrested but later befriended. That visit takes a dangerous turn when she discovers the girl's brutal father murdered. Here is a far cry from the elegant nightclubs, the sophisticated shops, and theaters of earlier episodes. This is the world of small garden apartments, teen clubs, and corner greasy spoons, and threats of youth violence after dark. Decoy was canceled after only one season, and it's a shame really, because Beverly Garland's portrayal of dedicated career woman Casey Jones, with her intelligence, confidence, and professional integrity, was really ahead of its time. But its 36 episodes recorded a piece of the history of a city in transition. Decoy's exploration of everyday crime acted out away from the studio backlot was one of the few 1950s television shows that takes some of the rose-colored tint off an overly idealized era. Its guerrilla style of camera work left a document of an almost lost New York that in some places still lingers just under the surface.